Can you discuss the history of African Americans getting the right to vote, then losing the right to vote, then getting, how did all that happen?
So after the Civil War, there was a big push to extend voting rights to African American men. Not all African Americans, but African American men. And this was something that was advocated for during the war as well. But one of the big, there are really two big reasons, I think, that black males got the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. One is the Republican Party wanted to get all these new voters. And of course, the party of Lincoln was going to be attractive for all the African American newly freed slaves. But the other argument, I think this is an important one that endures throughout U.S. history, is that black men fought honorably and valiantly in the Civil War to preserve the Union. And there was a very strong argument to be made that if these individuals are fighting and dying for the country, they should be able to vote in its highest elections. There's a very good movie called Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick from 25 years ago, but it depicts an all-black regiment in the Civil War, and I think it's a good introduction to this topic. So after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was enacted, and there was a little bit of arm twisting to get the southern states to agree to ratify it, but that happened. But after, Lincoln's memory faded and the Reconstruction era waned, you had much less federal control and pressure over the southern states. And so many southern states did a lot of things that effectively took the right to vote away from African American men. The KKK and other organizations pressured blacks into not voting. Jim Crow laws were passed that deprived blacks of the ability to make a living easily. Things like poll taxes and literacy tests were required. Grandfather clause laws insisted that someone have a grandfather who was eligible to vote before he could vote. So in practice, by the 1880s through the 1960s, voting was not really very easily done by blacks in the South. It's not until you get to the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s and the enactment of the Federal Voting Rights Act that black voting is revived in a meaningful way.
Can you discuss how the right to vote was extended to women?
Sure. The women's suffrage movement was many generations in the making and goes back to the mid-1800s, but it finally gets over the top in the early 1900s after World War I. And just as was true with blacks, the service that women provided in the all-out war mobilization effort of World War I was an important moral imperative to their getting the right to vote. So, we think of Rosie the Riveter as a World War II idea, but in World War I, women really filled the jobs that men vacated when they went off to war, and they made the economy work, and the vote was part of the reward they got for doing that. Indeed, if you take a step back, throughout American history, political equality is often linked with military sacrifice. That you're not a full-blown citizen of the United States until you are called upon and able to sacrifice militarily. So voting and jury service and office holding and military and militia service, they're often all talked about together as this cluster of political rights, which is why, for example, well before we got to same-sex marriage, the first battleground for same-sex equality was gays in the military, because there's this deeply held instinct that until you are fully taken equally in the military, you're not going to be fully taken equally in the society.
Was military experience one of the reasons why the vote was extended to 18-year-olds?
Indeed it was, and to poor people in the 1960s and 70s when we lowered the voting age nationally to 18 and eliminated poll taxes that in effect had disenfranchised people who didn't have means. You ask, well, what's going on in America in the 60s and early 70s? Well, Vietnam is going on. Who's dying in the fields of Vietnam? Young, poor men. And so there was a very powerful argument that if these kids are sacrificing their lives for America, they have to be able to vote for a president to get us out of the war.